Commodore's a person on Hyperion. He's a total bore. Is the Commodore? Oh, a Commodore's a person on Hyperion. He's a person that you meet each day. A Megarian's a person on Hyperion, not agrarian. A Megarian's a person on Hyperion. They're the people that you meet each day. A Thramatologist's a person on Hyperion, a type of scientist. A Thramatologist's a person on Hyperion. She's a person that you see on the Hyperion 3. She's a person that you see each day.
Direction point! Direction point!
A Doctor Who podcast network.
Hi everybody, welcome back to Doctor Who Literature, a member of the Direction Point Doctor Who Podcast Network. My name is Jason. This is the first week of our 4-week season on the Trial of a Time Lord, Season 23, the 1986 season of Doctor Who. But unlike my previous 4-week season on William Hartnell, this 4-week season about Season 23 is going to be spread out over quite a long time, because you see the 4 Trial of a Time Lord novelizations are going to be released out of order. Terror of the Vervoids first, followed eventually by the season premiere, novelized as The Mysterious Planet but televised as parts 1 through 4, and then the conclusion, The Ultimate Foe, sometime after that, followed much later by Mind Warp, parts 5 through 8, as we know them on television. I'm going in publication order, of course, so we do have many other books to discuss as they come out in between the 4 trial stories, including the long-delayed release of Philip Martin's novelization of his earlier Season 22 story, Vengeance on Varos, which was released as Book 106, but came out long after Books 105 and 107. The Trial of a Time Lord season was very troubled production-wise. I would encourage you strongly, if you can, to find the Season 23 Blu-ray box set, or at least the 4-component original DVDs that came out about 15 years ago. One of the contributors to that box set is Jim Sangster, whose voice you just heard performing the opening number a couple of minutes ago, and whose voice you will hear during the interview coming up just after the break. Trial of a Time Lord season gives us much to discuss, but because the books come out spaced far apart and out of order, our conversation is going to be rather oblique. So Jim and I will jump right into it by discussing parts 9 through 12. We're going to discuss the novelization written by Pip and Jane Baker in their own inimitable style. We are going to discuss the cover picture. Yes, that cover painting, which nearly got me in trouble at home. You will notice that my episode thumbnail for this week does not include a detail from the cover painting. For all 4 trial stories, we are only going to use the Gallifreyan logo rather than the cover of any of the 4 trial books. And if you want to blame anybody, please blame the cover artist for the Terror of the Vervoids novelization. Let's get to it.
Traveling the Vortex.
Are you ready to embark on an epic journey through time and space? Join the thousands of Whovians around the world who've discovered Traveling the Vortex, the ultimate Doctor Who podcast for die-hard fans and curious newcomers alike.
Every week, we dive deep into the Whoniverse, discussing the episodes, theories, and hidden gems. We dissect the Doctor's adventures, share behind-the-scenes stories, and explore the legacy of this iconic show.
Traveling the Vortex brings fans together, fostering a global community of Whovians. Whether you're a fan of classic or new Who, there's something for everyone.
Join us on this incredible journey as we unravel the mysteries of time and space.
Don't miss out. Subscribe to Traveling the Vortex today on your favorite podcast platform.
Traveling the Vortex. Your ticket to adventure awaits.
Traveling the Vortex is a proud member of the Direction Point Podcast Network. You're listening to the Doctor Who Literature Podcast. Keep turning the pages.
So the first thing I did, Jim Sangster, when I knew that I was going to be talking about Doctor Who, The Trial of a Time Lord, episodes 9 through 12 with you, colloquially known as Terror of the Vervoids, is I went to my shelf to look for my DVDs. Now, I've sold off the original DVDs on eBay, although I did watch them when they first came out in the States over a decade ago. And I pulled the Blu-rays. Now, the only part of the Blu-rays that I watched when they came out for my pilgrimage was the 4 episodes of what we now think of as Vervoids, plus the special edition, which removes all of the trial scenes and adds slightly less dated special effects than what you would have seen in 1986. So last night, I went back and I watched the making of documentary, and this would have been for the first time seeing it in over a decade. I was surprised to find myself confronted with a 16-year-old version of you with the exact same hair color that I have now, talking about the production of Terror of the Vervoids from what I expect is John Nathan Turner's point of view. So how did you come to be drafted for the Trial of a Time Lord DVDs many, many, many moons ago?
I begged. So I'd done a few of the DVDs with Ed Stradling, and when I was looking ahead to the Trial of a Time Lord, and I realised that a lot of the contributors are, let's say they're going to have a position. They'll all be saying, that's what the producer wanted. And very few of the people who might have taken his side will be involved. So I suggested to Ed that maybe I could stand in for John Nathan Turner's point of view, so someone is in his corner. Subsequently, Steve Broster ended up doing the DVDs, but Ed recommended me. So one sunny afternoon, I was at a hotel in Covent Garden, and what I love about that is the way that Steve edits it. So me and Clayton Hickman look like we're a double act.
That's right.
We were recorded on separate days. I didn't even know Clayton was going to be a part of it, but it just, because we've got a similar sense of humor and we're old mates, we were making a lot of the same jokes, so we could sort of intercut us and play it. Like I'd set up the thing about all the cliffhangers where there's a crash zoom on Colin's face, and then Clayton reenacts one of the crash zooms.
That's right.
And then there's the thing where I start quoting Edward's last line before he gets electrocuted, and they dub it on. And I don't know whether they use clever trickery, but it seems to match word for word and beat for beat.
Yes, because Edwards makes the comment, "We don't want you breaking your neck, at least not until."
And I really want to know how that sentence was going to end. Yeah.
How does that sentence end?
That was the whole thing, was that I was going to be there to represent JNT, which is not necessarily how I feel about the story, because certainly when it went out, which we'll get to later, I was not a fan. I was very much not a fan.
So Clayton Hickman on the DVD appears to be standing in for Bonnie Langford, who at that point was not participating. Colin Baker is there. Eric Sayward is there to blame everything on JNT. You have a couple of the guest cast members there. So the funniest comment that you made is that this is not just a luxury ocean liner in the year 2986. Mysteriously set 1,000 years exactly in the future after the story is aired, but it also appears to be a 1980s themed cruise. And when the Mogarians are playing a video game, you dismissively refer to the video game as Space Invaders. As somebody who grew up, the 1980s was the first decade for which I was alive every single day, missing the earlier part of the 1970s. So I was there for the evolution of video games, and I am here to tell you that is not Space Invaders. That's Galaga. Totally different game engine altogether.
I don't care. Yeah, I was sort of generalizing by calling it Space Invaders. It's an old video game. I mean, that's not even the most egregious mistake I make on those DVDs. Yeah, there was a bit, I think in the first, so for the thing for Mysterious Planet, where I proclaim proudly that I'd looked up all the words, all the really difficult words, including the word Valyard, And I'd looked it up in our family dictionary, and it meant Doctor of Law. And then when the DVD came out, there was a thread on Gallifrey Base proclaiming Jim Sangster is a liar. And I thought, that's a bit much. What's gone on here? And one of the people has pointed out that there's no dictionary in the world where that definition is given. Now, I definitely looked up every single word. I looked up sagacity. I looked up antediluvian. The Colin Baker era was full of words I could look up. But Valeyard isn't one of them. And I was thinking, where did that come from? And then I found out that it comes from a Gary Russell preview in Doctor Who magazine.
Oh.
So I tackled him. I said, listen here, you. why are you telling people that Valeyard means Doctor of Law? He said, well, I'd met Robert Holmes. And Robert Holmes told me that in the next season, they've got this character called the Valeyard. And that's an ancient word for Doctor of Law. It's a bit of a pun, having a Doctor of Law facing down a Doctor of Time. So that's how we realised Robert Holmes was trolling us all from the very beginning, planting this seed to go into DWM to hint at the identity of the Valeyard. And then, as far as I can tell, he just made the word up. I can't find any evidence at all for it to be a real word.
Because of the fragmented and fractured way in which the Trial of a Time Lord books come out, we are talking about Terror of the Vervoids first. I have not reread Mysterious Planet in about 5 or 6 years. It is the next trial book up on Doctor Who literature, but not next week. And this is the only one of the 4 that you're appearing on. My recollection is that Terence, in the novelization for Mysterious Planet, gives the Robert Holmes definition of what the word Valeyard means. So me, sitting there in suburbia in the late 1980s, I also believed that Valeyard was an actual word that had a meaning, and I incorporated it into a school advanced placement history class at age 16, where we were staging the impeachment trial of former American President Andrew Jackson. And of course, nobody knew the word either way, so nobody fact-checked me, and it didn't affect my grade. But I also, because of Terrence Dix, I believed anything Terrence Dix said, and he put it in the book. So either he didn't look it up, or he was in on Robert Holmes's joke.
I would love someone to confirm either way. As far as I can tell, it's a made-up word. But if somebody can find any citation, any evidence of the past to find out where this word came from, I would love to hear that. But I'm also quite happy to think that Robert Holmes was just messing us about.
I have been asking the Darren Mooney questions on this show for quite a while. It is difficult to ask those questions with Trial of a Time Lord. I came of age reading the books before the episodes aired. To the best of my recollection, Mysterious Planet did not air on my local PBS until September 1988, 2 years after the fact. My reason for believing this is because the paperback for Vervoids comes out in early 1988. That was the first time that I was aware that there was a Trial of a Time Lord season. And reading the first chapter of the book in the store is how I learned that Perry had died, or so we all thought at the time. So for me, Trial of a Time Lord is not a single 14-part story. It is 4 separate stories with very loose and increasingly flimsy connective tissue. So when I did my top 60, I included 4 separate entries for Trial, and I don't think any of them made my top 60, but we'll verify that shortly. When Fraser did his 60 for 60 list, using me as part of his influence, he did include Trial of a Time Lord as exactly 1 story. But this is my show, so we're going to do things my way. And I will ask you, my usual question for people, and this is just taking word for word from Darren Mooney, is does Terror of the Vervoids belong on a list of the top 60 Doctor Who stories of all time? The problem that I run into is that the most common answer that I get on the show is, well, I don't make lists. So nobody is ever able to match me by saying it is literally on my top 60. So what I want to do...
Who doesn't make lists? What's going on here? This is I make lots of lists. I've got lists for everything. But it is tricky. I mean, like Doctor Who magazine, the last story poll they did, like of the whole of every Doctor Who story, they messed it up by doing it in Doctor order, so we didn't get a really cohesive look at everything in comparison with each other. But the 2020, I think it was, poll, they classed Trial of a Time Lord as one story, but they also gave ratings for the individual episodes, individual stories.
So I have the 2014 DWM list up on my desktop. Trial of a Time Lord is classified as number 168 out of 241, which is pretty poor. But they also, in brackets, or as we call them here in the States, parentheses, they have it in brackets. They have The Ultimate Foe as 168, but they have Mind Warp and Terror of the Vervoids ranked at number 174, sharing a spot with The Leisure Hive, or as you would say, The Leisure Hive, which to my mind is much better than the 174th best Doctor Who story of all time. So let me ask you, does Terror of the Vervoids belong as one of the 70 worst Doctor Who stories ever made, as per the Solons at DWM 10 years ago?
That's a nice flip. I'd say that, the readers of Doctor Who magazine have always felt that Vervoids was better than the other two proper segments. Ultimate Foe tends to come out top because it's got the most revelations. For me, watching it at the time, I was so disappointed. It was one of my first fan moments of absolute, this is not for me. So I would say it's not the best segment in that season. And that season isn't the best of the two Collins seasons. And objectively, Collins not the best Doctor. And it's not the best Pip and Jane book or episode. And the 80s isn't the best decade. So, if you just leave it as that, even though there are stories I love, and even though I am a JNT apologist, the whole idea of the trial is deeply flawed. I think the reason why this one comes out highest is because it's the most traditional. It's the one that feels slightly more cohesive and standalone compared to the other stories, which are very much dependent on the trial or the interference of the Time Lords. So, yeah, for me, it's a difficult one because objectively it is terrible. It is a really shoddy, cheap-looking production. The special effects are a major step back. The music, it's the last time that the Radiophonic Workshop will be called upon, and Malcolm Clark gives his worst score as well. So it's a terrible production all around. And yet, because of I hope this isn't too offensive to use this language, but I would class myself as a Trial of a Time Lord survivor, because it was deeply disappointing for a lot of us. When Chris Chibnall appeared on that open air chat show to talk about Trial, he was representing the membership of the Merseyside local group. And that's how we felt. We felt cheated. We felt let down. We felt entitled enough to make poor Pip and Jane Baker the cause of all of our misery, when in truth they were the saviors of the show. They came in at the last minute. They delivered what was expected of them, and then they had to deliver a conclusion to a thing they hadn't even created. But at the time, we felt really, really bitter. But then over the next 12 months, we learned how to love Trial of a Time Lord in the way that British people do, by just taking the mickey out of it, just tearing it apart, making it funny, making it enjoyable, quoting lines out of context. Some of the more obscure lines, like the Commodore saying, "I'll match you for candor," which is incomprehensible the way he delivers it. "I'll match you for candor." And any normal person might say quid pro quo. That's what he means. But because it's Pip and Jane Baker, they have this very florid, overly fussy, sesquipedalian style.
Coming back to the word sesquipedalian, the opening song for this episode, which my audience has already heard, is you borrowing from Sesame Street, the TV show that is made in my hometown and with which I grew up watching daily between the late 1970s and the early 1980s, before Elmo took over the show. But I would hear the "Who Are the People in Your Neighborhood" sung by the late Bob McGrath several times a week because that's how often they played it. When my daughter was born in 2010, I immediately jumped her back on the Sesame Street bandwagon, and I would show her various Sesame Street clips on YouTube. By the early 2010s, Sesame Street had reformatted itself. So instead of a magazine-style show with live-action segments interspersed with advertisements like commercial TV, but instead of advertisements, they're short cartoons advertising numbers and letters. They changed the show so that the first 15 minutes were all live host segments filmed at the Kaufman Astoria studio in Queens, New York, where I used to work nearby. And I would see crew from the shows hanging out at the same Starbucks where we would go for our mid-morning break. But Adam Sandler shows up as a celebrity guest during one of the live-action segments, and he sings Elmo a song, which he wrote, presumably in coordination with the Sesame Street writers, trying to find words that rhyme with Elmo. And, of course, there are none. So he has to take other words that end in L and add mo to the end of it. So when he's trying to find words that rhyme with Elmo, he uses the word sesquipedalia. And Elmo shouts out, "No, it doesn't rhyme with Elmo." And when my daughter was 18 months old, she thought this was the funniest thing ever recorded to videotape. And the way she would react to that video was like a toddler mosh pit. So sesquipedalian is, for me, one of the indispensable words ever to come out of Sesame Street. And here you are using it in a Doctor Who literature episode that begins with a Sesame Street homage.
Entirely coincidental.
I'm going to give the opposite point of view about Vervoids. For me, it is not on my personal top 60 list. I had to struggle to fit Colin in there because my top 60 is not an absolute value of each individual story, but it's a representative list where some stories are standing in for others, like the Aztecs is not there because the massacre already is, etc. So unlike Fraser, I did not put Trial on my top 60. But I think Terror of the Vervoids is the best story of the Trial season. And I think the Trial season is the better of the two Colin Baker seasons. For me, that is crystallized by watching the first Ravelock scene in Mysterious Planet when I saw it in 1988 and realizing that just flipping the relationship, making Perry British rather than pretending she's American, and having her and Colin Baker get along is the way to go with the character. So for me, that set the season off on the right note, and I enjoyed each one of those stories more than I did the previous season 22. The disappointment for Vervoids is all in the production values, but not on the Pip and Jane Baker script. For me, the line, "I'll match you for candor," works very well in the book on the printed page where it's not delivered poorly because he's calling the Doctor a liar in a very clever way. Colin Baker insisted on complex vocabulary words going into the show because he studied law when he was younger and he had a deep love of the English language. So he included the word pusillanimous, leading me in my 7th grade English class to be the only student who could pronounce the word pusillanimous correctly because I had heard Colin Baker deliver it and nobody else in my class was watching Doctor Who. When I watched the documentary last night and they're interspersing clips of the Trial production, the Vervoids production, in between you and Clayton Hickman and Colin Baker and Michael Craig, the production is amateurish and it's bad. And when I was reading it in the book, it looked much better in my head in 2024 than it did on the printed page. But Michael Craig gives an anecdote in the documentary. And I don't know if Hayden Christensen watches Doctor Who DVDs in his spare time, but Hayden Christensen tells this story about how when he was filming the 2 Star Wars prequels, he would make the sound with his lightsaber. And George Lucas would say, no, we'll dub in the noise later. You don't have to do that. Michael Craig tells that exact same story relating to himself in 1986. So I don't know who's borrowing from who. I don't know if Michael Craig borrowed that from Hayden Christensen or if Hayden Christensen got it from the DVD or if they arrived at it each independently. But Michael Craig claims that he's there in rehearsal going zzz, zzz, whenever he fires his blaster, which doesn't look a thing like a blaster, by the way. Bad prop. But I don't know. I think Hayden Christensen may be a secret fan of the Doctor Who DVDs and borrowed this story from Michael Craig.
Well, Harrison Ford did the same thing with the first Star Wars movie. There's actual footage of him going bang. At this point, his apathy is palpable. He just, I can't believe this. He's so bored by it.
The reason that I drafted you for this episode, and I have this in my notes, and I probably booked you for this 18 months ago. What is the significance of Liverpool and the Liverpool accent to Terror of the Vervoids?
Well, before we get there, I'm going to hijack the show in the style of a Mogarian.
Uh-oh.
I'm going to turn the tables on you as we are going to play a game. Cue the music. This won't take long, hopefully, and listeners, you can join in too. So just as a preamble, I grew up in Liverpool in the north of England. I wasn't actually born in Liverpool. I was born just outside of Liverpool, so I don't count as a Scouser. By the way, for those who don't know, the word Scouser is based on the word scouse, which is a Liverpool variant of Irish stew. And because the population of Liverpool, I'm trying not to do a big history lecture like I often fall into, but I'm just going to do this anyway. The population of Liverpool and the idea of Liverpool as an identity in itself comes because of the migration of people from North and Southern Ireland, mixing with people who are coming up from Wales and mixing with the indigenous Lancastrian people. So the Scouse accent is only about 100 years old. It's one of the newest accents in the British Isles.
Huh.
Which is why it was quite interesting watching Flux and just listening out for, great, that's a Scouse accent, but it's about 50 years too early. So Liverpool has played a major part in the history of Doctor Who, both on screen and behind the scenes. In the 1980s, when I first joined fandom, I was in the Merseyside local group, the infamous Merseyside local group, which was the biggest local group of the DWAS at the time. I was a guest of Cy Hart on the Library of Impossible Things podcast recently, so you can hear more of my backstory there. But as I say, I'm not actually a Scouser, but I did grow up in Liverpool. Liverpool gave us 5 regular cast members, plus loads of guest stars. But the game is, who is the first contributor to Doctor Who to come from Liverpool?
Interesting. This would work better for me as a multiple choice, because being your stereotypical ugly American, I am only dimly aware, or at least I was when I became a fan, of what parts of the UK contributed what to Doctor Who and which accent came from where. I could give you an equally long dissertation about the evolution of the stereotypical Brooklyn accent, which does have very strong roots in the Dutch influence on New York City. New York City, which began life as a Dutch colony, incorporated in 1626. I can tell you a lot more about the New York accent and various place names in the city than I can about Liverpool or Scout contributors to Doctor Who. If you make it a multiple choice, it might make it easier for me. But otherwise, that would be casting blindly at straws and mentioning names with no regard to where they're actually from.
Well, there are 2, possibly 3 Doctors. So if I say that the possibly 3 is David Morrissey from The Next Doctor.
I have dim memories that Tom Baker may be the Doctor answer to that question.
So Tom Baker and Paul McGann. Right? Tom Baker's accent is not remotely Scouse, and that's going to be a running theme of this. There are 2 companions from Liverpool. And I'll give you a clue. One of them's from the 70s.
All right, just as
Actually,
an
sorry, there are 3 companions, but in the classic series, there are 2.
Yes. John Bishop obviously would not count as the earliest that contributed to anything.
Yeah.
So I only know this from the DVD text commentaries, which when I am watching Doctor Who on DVD these days, it is more as a DVD text commentary production notes delivery system rather than watching the episodes as episodes. I am reading the subtitles while the episodes go on in the background. And anybody who followed my Twitter pilgrimage from 2020 to 2021 would note that I was posting screenshots with the captions whenever the captions were particularly funny or ironic. So I know that Elizabeth Sladen is going to fall into that category because she was adding northern euphemisms to her character that were unscripted. And she even made a reference in one of the episodes to calling one of her old contacts up north to get some information about a particular event. The other one I know comes from TARDIS Eruditorum, and that would have to be Maureen O'Brien as Vicky.
Very good. I'm going to put you out of your misery, by which I mean I'm going to give you the answer. I'm not going to put a bolt in the back of your head. I have an answer for this, and but there's also a trick answer. So the trick answer is, and I've got Simon Guerrier to help me with this to confirm it. David Whittaker was married to the actress June Barry, who was born in Liverpool, not far from where Maureen O'Brien would later grow up. And at the time of the show's creation, she was working on the Manchester soap Coronation Street. And as the first episode went out, I think she'd just done her last regular appearance. But it's very likely that Whittaker discussed his new job with her. So at the very least, she'd have been a sounding board for him in the run-up to the first recording. So technically, I think we can say June Barry from Liverpool was the first influence from Liverpool on Doctor Who. But that is a bit of a cheat. The proper answer is Jeremy Young, who played the caveman Cal in the first story. So the very first villain is from Liverpool. He later pops up as Lowry in Missions to the Unknown.
That's right.
Then we get Maureen O'Brien. Actually quite a big figure in Liverpool theatre because she was a founding member of the Everyman Theatre, which later had the Everyman Youth Group. And pretty much every Scouse actor of the 70s and 80s went through the Everyman. Or they went through the Playhouse, which was just round the corner. John Scott Martin makes his first appearance as a drunk Zarbi in The Web Planet. I don't know if he was the one who headbutted the camera, but it'd be funny if it was. And obviously, John Scott Martin later became a lead Dalek. So his connection to the series begins with the second season and ends with the penultimate season with Remembrance of the Daleks. But he also appears on screen in The Green Death and Robot.
He is the security guard getting strangled by the robot in part 1 with a distinctive beaky nose.
Yes. And then in The Chase, we see a clip of the Beatles. Now, it's a little known fact, this, but actually the Beatles were also from Liverpool. Never gets mentioned ever.
No. You don't say.
And I'll just do a sidestep. The Feast of Stephen is the first time that Doctor Who goes to Liverpool, even though obviously it's still in Shepherd's Bush or, Lime Grove, wherever they shot that episode. And originally the idea was that it was going to be a pastiche of Z-Cars, the police procedural, which was set in Liverpool. And like Z-Cars, no one in that scene is actually from Liverpool. And there's a really curious thing where the Doctor tells Stephen off, why are you doing that ridiculous accent? And because Peter Purvis is actually really good at the accent, he goes, everyone else is doing it. No one is doing a Scouse accent. And it's just a peculiarity that no one else seemed to get the memo that he would need everyone to be doing a Scouse accent. They're all doing generic Lancastrian, which is completely different. A lot of the listeners might have been shouting, Pauline Collins. She was obviously the very Liverpudlian, very trendy Liverpudlian Samantha Briggs in The Faceless Ones. Later played Queen Victoria in Tooth and Claw. bad news for you, she doesn't count. She was born in Devon. And then worse, she was brought up in New Brighton on the Wirral, which is the peninsula on the opposite side of the Mersey from Liverpool. So she doesn't even count, even though as Shirley Valentine, the Oscar-nominated Shirley Valentine, I can't remember a lot of Shakespeare, but I remember a lot of Willie Russell. So between Educating Rita and Shirley Valentine, that is hardwired in my head. So I adore Pauline Collins, but sorry, love, you don't count. Christopher Cole, who briefly turns up in The Seeds of Death before he's killed off.
Yes.
And then turns up in The Mutants, where he's killed off. And in The Mutants, I think we have the first instance of a Liverpool actor where you can hear the accent, but it is a bit diluted. Then obviously Elizabeth Sladen. But in Elizabeth Sladen's first story, I think in her first episode, one of the guards is played by an actor called Ray Dunbobbin, who looks like a hobbit. And he was later a star of Brookside. Now, we're going to be coming back to Brookside. It was one of the most groundbreaking soap operas in British TV history. It was filmed in Liverpool, produced by a largely Liverpool-based team. It told stories about Liverpool people. And it appeared on the very first night of Channel 4, which was the UK's fourth TV station. So in the early 80s, we only had 4 TV stations. That's why people were getting TV ratings of 20 million back then, because there wasn't a lot of competition. I'll just throw in there as well. Brookside, in the very early days, it was very big on social history. It was looking at day-to-day politics among the neighbours of a housing estate in East Liverpool. It had a brilliant synth theme tune that was, I'll say inspired, but what I mean is completely rips off Jean-Michel Jarre's Equinox Part 5, just slows it down, but it's the same tune. And it was regular viewing in our house. In the 1990s, it started trying to grab headlines with increasingly ludicrous plots involving murder, incest, drugs, and it kind of lost its way. But it was a bit like the Everyman Theatre. It was where every Scouse actor ended up or started off. So we're going to be coming back to Brookside. Then we get Tom Baker, obviously, who's from Scotland Road, which is at the time was one of the roughest areas of the city. It was a very, very industrial area. And someone that you probably wouldn't spot is Tom Georgeson, who is in Genesis of the Daleks. He plays a Khaled scientist.
And Legopolis.
And he pops up in Legopolis. He was one of the stars of a seminal drama called Boys from the Black Stuff, which is just about how miserable late 70s, early 80s Liverpool actually was. He's got a very strong Scouse accent, which is almost buried. But just because you've got Tom Georgeson, you've got John Scott Martin, Tom Baker, and Elizabeth Sladen. Up to this point, I'm going to say that Genesis of the Daleks episode 4 is probably the most Scouse episode of Doctor Who. Up to that point. Obviously, we've got Graham Williams, producer Graham Williams from Liverpool. Robert Keegan, who plays Sholach in the Rebus operation, was one of the only Z-Cars actors to actually be from Liverpool. David Yip, who's in Destiny of the Daleks. He became the first ever East Asian leading man on British TV in a show called The Chinese Detective. Before, he had a short run on Brookside.
And he was also in the James Bond film A View to a Kill as Bond's local American CIA contact.
And he has a very light Scouse accent, which you can't really hear in Destiny of the Daleks, because once again, everyone's diluting their accent. Kenneth Cope, even though you can hear the Scouse roots in Warriors of the Deep, he had, again, it's not a particularly strong Scouse accent. Viewers would know him from Coronation Street and the incredible Randall and Hopkirk Deceased. That's where he was mainly famous. Then a few surprises. So Michael J. Jackson, who plays the ginger brother in The King's Demons.
Yes.
He's from Brookside. He's off Brookside and he's a Scouser. In this list, there's 2 that really shocked me, and one of them is Del Henney, who's the leader of the military group in Resurrection of the Daleks. I don't think there's a trace of Scouse in his voice. Faith Brown, who's the lead Cryon in Attack of the Cybermen, she was mainly famous as an impressionist. It's funny, when I was watching Attack of the Cybermen, my dad looked at Flast and immediately said, "Is that Faith Brown?"
Huh.
I don't know what it was. I don't know which two things were the thing that gave it away. But she was very buxom, let's put it that way. Obviously, we've got Philip Martin, who wrote the 2 Seal stories. He's from Liverpool. Alexei Sayle, the genius comedian who appears in Revelation of the Daleks. It was weird when people said, they really hated him because he really took them out of the moment. But I think Alexei Sayle is fantastic. He's one of my favourite comedians. But I don't know if he ever really translated across to the States.
He did. He has a single scene in Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade. When I did my pilgrimage and I was trying to account for each one of the wilderness years in between Survival and Rose, I watched Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade because, as a Spielberg film, and I want to point out that right now in New York City at Film Forum on Houston Street in Lower Manhattan, they are doing a 2-week-long Spielberg festival, and I have not been able to get there because of work and life obligations. Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade probably has more Doctor Who actors in it than any other movie ever made. And that doesn't even include Frederick Yeager, who's in the credits and survives in a single still photograph. He appeared in a comedy sequence on the Hindenburg scene as a drunken former World War I flying ace who tries to chase after Harrison Ford and Sean Connery as they're escaping in a biplane. He tries to get in another biplane, but he's so drunk that he forgets to release the clamp and he blows up. That scene was deleted for pacing reasons, or that sequence was deleted, but Frederick Yeager's name does appear in the credits as World War I flying ace. There are so many other actors in that movie who had been on Doctor Who, and not just the obvious ones like Julian Glover, but Kevork Malikian, who is in Wheel in Space, has a fairly large part in Last Crusade, and Alexei Sayle is in a single scene playing an Arab sultan who is giving ordnance to the Nazi forces in exchange for a state-of-the-art Rolls-Royce. And that scene ends with him and Julian Glover doing a literal Marx Brothers routine. So Alexei Sayle goes, "You shall have machine guns, and you shall have tanks." And Julian Glover deadpans, "You're welcome," which is literally a Marx Brothers joke. So he's only in one scene, but it's a very, very funny scene.
The Hitler scene's deleted, isn't it?
No, Hitler with Michael Sheard he doesn't get any dialogue, but it is still in the movie.
Is he? Right, okay, because not a Scouser, but we're going to come back to that. Funny you should mention Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade. We're going to come back to that in about 45 seconds. Also in Revelation of the Daleks, and this was the other one that really shocked me, Clive Swift as Joe Bell is from Liverpool.
Clive Swift, who did the most combative back page interview in the history of DWM.
The one where I was told they checked in with Russell T Davies to say, "Look, this went a bit bad. Are you okay with us running it?" And he went, "It's fine. He's not coming back." And he is possibly best known outside of Doctor Who to North American TV enthusiasts as the long-suffering Richard in Keeping Up Appearances. And also from Keeping Up Appearances, we have Geoffrey Hughes, who plays Onslow. And he plays Mr. Popplewick in the last 2 episodes of Trial of a Time Lord. Oh. And he's another person who's mainly famous for being in Coronation Street, but I think outside of the UK, Keeping Up Appearances. But I've just skipped one, because the reason why we're talking about Liverpool is Tony Scogo. He has one line of dialogue at the very beginning where he reveals that his name is Grenville, and you must be mistaking me for somebody else. But he's the first person to have an undiluted Scouse accent in the history of Doctor Who. Everyone else who appears in Doctor Who is doing RP or something else, but he is pure Scouse. He'd been a trade unionist in the 1970s, and like a lot of actors who were in the beginning of Brookside, he was in trade unions, very political, and he also played in a folk band on the pub circuit. He was in Brookside from the very beginning, and he was cast as Grenville by Chris Clough, who had been a director on Brookside. That's where he got his experience from, along with Malcolm Tierney. Although he's from Manchester, Malcolm Tierney had played the local gangster Tommy McCardle in Brookside. But Tony Scargo gave up acting in the early 90s to focus on politics again, and he became a local councillor for the district of Knowsley, which is where I grew up.
Huh.
I've just got one more from the classic series. We can go into the new series if you like. Well, it's the new series, the 20-year-old new series. Ken Dodd, who played the toll keeper in Delta and the Bannermen. Now, here's another one. I don't know if you're not a Doctor Who fan and you're not from the UK. I don't know if you'd know who Ken Dodd is or was.
I only know him secondhand because of the backlash. When I was watching Doctor Who, when I was watching the McCoy years in the late 80s, with the exception of Stubby K, and I grew up on hearing the Guys and Dolls soundtrack on cassette on car rides, I didn't know who most of the UK actors were in any event. So I didn't know who was stunt casting versus who was casting in the ordinary course of auditions. It never struck me that Ken Dodd, or for that matter Nicholas Parsons, were unpopular casting choices. I thought Nicholas Parsons gives an incredibly nuanced and complex performance in Curse of Fenric, and the fact that he was considered a misfit for the show didn't occur to me until I started reading that opinion on Records Doctor Who a few years later. Ken Dodd made zero impression on me whatsoever, for good or for ill, when I first saw Delta and the Bannermen. And I'll talk more about that on the Delta episode. But I didn't know that he was somebody well known, and that many people felt some very vocal people, I shouldn't say many, some very vocal people felt he shouldn't have been on the show. I wouldn't have been aware of that until I hit Rec Arts a few years later.
I think you were right in the first place. Many people, I think the majority of people thought he was terrible casting because I'm going to say this with all confidence. Ken Dodd, at that point in the show's history, was the most famous guest star to have ever appeared on the show in the UK. More famous than Kate O'Mara in her first appearance, because she didn't do Dynasty until in between her two stories. He was a Liverpool comedian. He came up through the variety circuit in the 1950s. Incredibly funny. I saw him once on a live. It was a charity gala, so he was sharing the bill with loads of other people. So he was only an hour late finishing because he had an hour slot and he did another hour because he just couldn't stop. The most relentlessly funny man. His comedy was a theatre of the absurd. His basic philosophy is everything is daft, so let's have some fun together. His comedy didn't have victims. It wasn't political. It was just silliness. And to put it into perspective, he was already very famous when the Beatles arrived. And because he had a second career as a singer, he was, and it's an odd statistic, this one, he was the biggest selling male solo artist in the UK of the 1960s.
Huh.
But that's mainly because all of the other acts were bands. But towards the end, you get Tom Jones. But Ken Dodd sold millions of records, mainly to nans who loved his mawkish sentimentality. If you can find a record of his called Tears, it'll give you an idea of him. But he was huge. Now, going back to Liverpool, if you go to Liverpool by train, you'll arrive at Lime Street Station, which faces St. George's Hall. It's a civic building that's appeared in tons of movies and TV shows, including Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade. The colonnades that they walk through when he meets Hitler are on the front of St. George's Hall. It was also the front of Gotham City Hall in the 2022 The Batman. And in Flux for possibly the first time in its history, it appears as itself in flux. So that's the same building that Hitler was in Indiana Jones, when I think Jazz meets up with a young lad on the colonnade, and that young lad is later the fellow who played John Lennon in The Devil's Chord.
Oh.
But just going back to Lime Street Station, I'm going off on a bit of a tangent, but I love this. Right by the main exit, there are two bronze statues. One of them is of Ken Dodd, and it's a popular. Everyone wants to get their photo with the Ken Dodd statue. The other is of a portly middle-aged woman, and I think most people just assume that she's there as a companion to Ken Dodd, as the Mrs. in a lot of his jokes. You know, it starts a lot of his routines with, "By Jove, Mrs., what a wonderful day! What a wonderful day for..." And then here comes the joke. She's largely forgotten now, but she was actually a local Liverpool MP called Bessie Braddock. She was a tireless campaigner for decent housing in Liverpool. She was pushing to get rid of the old slums and get proper housing for working class people. She was a fighter for workers' rights, and she was a leading figure in the creation of the UK Disability Act. So while she's largely forgotten now, you may, or your listeners may have heard of an anecdote where she is absolutely central to it. The problem is the anecdote is often wrongly attributed to another MP, Nancy Astor, who was notably beautiful. So you've just got to think about it to realise this anecdote wouldn't work with her. It was Bessie Braddock who tackled Winston Churchill for being drunk one evening, and he replied, "Madam, you are ugly, but I shall be sober in the morning." And that's kind of a famous anecdote about Winston Churchill being really pissy with someone, and it was Bessie Braddock. And she shares the front of Liverpool Lime Street Station with Ken Dodd. So that's a whistle-stop tour of the classic series of Liverpool.
Were you aware that there was a short-lived American action-adventure series called Lime Street in 1985?
I was not.
It was an interesting show. It was Robert Wagner, long-running American character actor, was the series lead. And the point is, he is both a single dad and a sort of detective. And there was a British character on the show. I didn't watch the show. It didn't run very long because the actress who played his daughter on the show was a girl named Samantha Smith, who was not an actress by trade, but she came to fame for writing a letter to the head of the then head of the Soviet Union, Andropov, asking why Russia was hell-bent on nuclear war. She was then invited to the Soviet Union as a guest, and she became 11, 12 years old, a media celebrity. She was then cast as an actress on this show and did a very good job by all accounts. But about 4 months into production, she was killed in an airplane crash coming back from an event, and that was the end of the show. So it only ran for not even half a season. I have never seen an episode. I don't believe it's ever been released to streaming or social media because so little of it exists. But I am very the name of that show has been in my head for years because I was very a big Samantha Smith fan in the mid-'80s as a school child of about the same age. So the name Lime Street always stuck in my head. It wasn't until just now that I realized that probably is based on a very specific geographic location.
There's a lot of cross-pollination with, I'll say, Merseyside and New York, because it's always reputed that the gardens in Birkenhead were the inspiration for Central Park. Now you look at the gardens in Birkenhead and it's a small few yards, but apparently it was the design of it, the layout of it, they often say was an inspiration. But also so many productions are made in either Liverpool or Glasgow, doubling up for New York because a lot of the buildings look like old New York. There's a gorgeous sequence in the first Captain America movie where he's running through. He's just got the super serum, and
it's supposed to be the Brooklyn Navy Yards.
Yeah, so he comes out of that area to try and chase down the assassin, and that is shot in Manchester. And then he turns a corner, runs onto the docks, and he's suddenly in Liverpool. And it's quite distracting. But
Jenna Louise Coleman has a very brief appearance earlier in that movie before she hit it big on Doctor Who.
Yeah.
before she
Well,
dropped the Louise.
I mean, I'm looking at obviously in the new series, and we've got Paul McGann sort of in between the two. And I'd already mentioned David Morrissey. There are a couple of other actors I could mention, but I'm just going to focus on Flux, because Flux suddenly becomes the most Scouse thing that Doctor Who has ever done, and probably one of the most Scouse things that the BBC has ever done. Obviously, John Bishop, who we were talking about an undiluted Scouse accent. John Bishop has a Scouse accent more Scouse than any real Scouser I know. It's even for me, it's almost impenetrable at times. But his mum and dad. So Sue Jenkins, who plays his mum, she was on Brookside as the long-suffering Jackie Corkill, and his dad is Paul Broughton, who played Eddie Banks. The reason why I'm highlighting him in particular is because on Brookside, Eddie Banks was married to Rosie Banks, and Rosie Banks was played by Susan Twist, who suddenly popped up everywhere since Russell T Davies came back. But they were involved in the biggest Brookside storyline ever, which was they discovered a dead body under their neighbour's patio and realised that she'd killed her husband and buried the body. And their reaction was absolutely stunning when he puts his hand in the hole and he goes, "There's something down here," and then it's a hand, and it just became the biggest story they did. Also, you've got, I mean, there's loads of Scouse actors who playing Scouse characters in there, but you've also got Craig Else, who plays Carvanista, who I've just found out is also from Liverpool. But obviously, they also shot a lot of scenes for Flux in the Museum of Liverpool, where Dan doesn't work, but Diane does.
Yes, where he is a sort of shadow unofficial tour guide.
Yeah, and then there's the Albert Dock, which, as I've already mentioned, was in Captain America. That was also where the famous Who shop briefly had a satellite store in 1995, where I briefly worked. And where the TARDIS lands, it's actually facing a gap where a hotel used to be, the Kingston Hotel, and that's where the Merseyside local group used to meet up. Certainly, but in the late 80s, like 1986 to 7 to maybe 8.
When you were telling Chris Chibnall to go on TV and criticize Pippa Cream Baker to their faces, yeah.
Yeah, exactly, yeah. There's also a gorgeous shot there's a few shots of Dan's street, which obviously it's got Anfield, the home of Liverpool Football Club, the big stadium at the end of the street. I got a lovely photo sent to me from a mate who is a big Liverpool football fan, and he took a shot of himself on that street. And that's how I discovered that's not in Liverpool. It's a composite. Because of the logistics of shooting around there, they've got a shot of the stadium and then they've composited it onto a Cardiff street. So it's a very good architectural match, but it's not actually in Liverpool. But even with that, that's probably the most Liverpool story we've got. And I'm only saying that because Tony Scoggo is the most Scouse actor up to that point appearing in Doctor Who.
There's probably a longer form essay that I could write about the role that the Brooklyn accent plays in American film and TV, because for the longest time, any Hollywood movie would always have one comedy in it with a very pronounced Brooklyn accent, to the point that when Disney was making Frozen 10 years ago, and Frozen has very specific connections to the very specific part of Brooklyn where I live, which I won't get into. But it was decided that the trolls in Frozen had to have Brooklyn accents because of the specific role they play in the movie. And when Callie and I were watching Buffy the Vampire Slayer, Sunnydale has a police force. It obviously doesn't get much play on the series until the last couple of seasons, when they do a few episodes in the police station. Every cop with a speaking role on Buffy in seasons 6 and 7, and we don't know quite where in California Sunnydale is supposed to be. It might be Orange County. It might be San Bernardino or Riverside County. There's a mention to Highland High School. Highland is about 60 miles east of Los Angeles. We don't quite know where Sunnydale is in relation to Los Angeles, but all the cops speak in Brooklyn accents.
That's because all American cops speak with a Brooklyn accent. That's just that's the rule, isn't it?
It is.
In my head, I'd see coffee and donuts, and I'd hear the Brooklyn accent.
But before that, all cops had Irish accents because many New York City policemen were part of the Irish diaspora coming to America starting in the 1840s. The purest example of that would be Sterling Hayden's character in The Godfather, Captain McCluskey. He's given an Irish name for a very specific reason.
I think you find the purest example of that is Sean Connery in The Untouchables, isn't it?
Yeah, 15 years later.
Winning an Oscar, clearly not for that film.
Well, we are running
That's the
out
Chicago
of time.
way. He says with a Glaswegian accent.
Okay, we've got about 5 minutes left, so we got to talk about the elephant. Let's talk about the cover to Terror of the Vervoids. I have read most of my targets on PDFs for the longest time. So it has been about 20 years since I took this book out and actually looked at the physical copy of the book. So I had it face up on my desk earlier in the week when I was reading and writing and recording the audio essay. So my wife gets up early one morning to feed the cats, and she stumbles through the kitchen, and she happens to see in my workspace this book face up on my desk at 6:15 in the morning. And she wakes me up. We need to talk. And I thought it was something serious. She wanted to know why I had such a pornographic book cover available in my home where small children live. What is the deal with this cover?
Well, it's representing what the Vervoids look like on screen, which I heard one person describe it as it looked like the after effects of an explosion in a sex toy factory. Because clearly the designer has thought, well, it's asexual reproduction for plants, so therefore let's put sex organs onto the design of it to make, but they go a little bit too far, I think. It's in the book they're described as having faces like closed buds, which I think is very, very delicate. The book's got a lovely description of them actually, and talks about the vines creating the skeleton. So at least they've thought a little bit about how the Vervoids might get about.
And Pip and Jane go into that on the same DVD documentary that you were in, talking about the origin of the Vervoids, because humans destroy plants. What if the plants fight back? But Clayton Hickman gives an anecdote that you had also repeated to me independently about how the local news agent did not like the DWM cover that had the Vervoid on it.
Yeah, because of the way that magazines are stacked at WH Smith, they made a complaint because they had loads of complaints from concerned parents who thought they were looking at something that they weren't looking at when the magazine was partially visible among Woman's Own and the Radio Times or whatever. Well, what I'd say about that cover is, okay, so it's representing how the Vervoids were designed, but it's a disappointing cover from Tony Macero. He's done some beautiful covers in the past, and this is not one of them. It's just very under-textured. It's very flat. It looks a bit like Fuzzy Felt, like the Fuzzy Felt Farm or something like that. It's just, I don't think it's particularly successful. I would love it if Alistair Pearson could have done a repaint of that, but it wasn't selected for a blue spine. I think you'd still struggle to get around the fact that the Vervoids look like a genitalia explosion.
And yeah, and for those of you who are longtime followers of the show or who are discovering it on Spotify or your podcast app of choice, you will note that for each episode thumbnail, I use a detail from the book cover. And that's just for variety, so I'm not using the same thumbnail each week. And it's to disguise the fact that I have very few computer graphic or Photoshop skills, so I don't have the ability to do it myself. So I use the book cover and I credit the artist in the show notes and in the script each week. For the entire Trial of a Time Lord season, at the wise counsel and insistence of my producer Jim Sangster, I will not be using the detail of the cover for any of the 4 trial books, which come out of sequence over a period of months. They don't all come out in a row. I will be using the Time Lord logo on the back cover of the book as my cover detail because I cannot, in good conscience, use this. Having already received at least one email from a listener about the use of language in this show, which is often played in car rides with children in the back seat, I cannot use this as my detail. So for all 4 trial stories, they are all getting tarred with the same brush. I'm only going to be using the Time Lord Gallifreyan logo, which was originally seen sideways as the Vogan logo in Revenge of the Cybermen, but that is neither here nor there. Just clearing up some last-minute issues as well. When John Peel wrote the novelization of Dalek's Master Plan, he gave all those police officers names taken from the cast of Z-Cars.
He did. I thought it was really cute. I know you're going to be going into the book in more detail, so I'm not going to start quoting passages from it or anything like that. But again, I don't know if this is true, but I was told by a previously mentioned DWM former editor that Pip and Jane Baker had a really interesting way of writing. So they'd set themselves up in the room, and one of them would be lying on a couch dictating while the other would type.
Huh.
And then after they'd done a chapter or so, they'd swap, and the other would take on the typing duties. Now, I might be guilty of stereotyping here, but I think that Jane might have been responsible for the first full chapter in this, because all the characters are introduced with detailed descriptions of their clothing and their styles. And she goes into the sort of detail that I don't think many men would pick up on. And it is beautiful, the fact that each of them gets a little introduction, and we get told what they're wearing, what their color palette is. And she uses language that I don't think Pip Baker is probably going to be grasping for.
And this explains a point that I touch on in the audio essay, which has already been written and recorded, so I can't go back and change it. If Jane wrote chapter 1, Pip writes chapter 2, there is zero introduction to Bonnie Langford in chapter 2. We get her name and the fact that she's the Doctor's fitness instructor, and that's it. Nothing about Bonnie Langford's appearance or unique banana-colored costume as seen on screen. Later on in the story, we are told that she is a redhead, and that might have been a Jane chapter, but there is nothing to let us know in chapter 2 what Bonnie Langford looks like.
It's
and
a shame
I feel
as well,
that if that had been in a chapter that Jane wrote, it would have been much more detailed.
I don't know what's going on with this book. Maybe it was rushed. I mean, we know that they worked very fast, and maybe that's how they got through it. You know, you've got to take over the type, and my hands are hurting now. But the problem I find with this book is that they tend to introduce backstory to the characters just before they're killed off. They do this with Kimber, they do it with Lasky, rather than seeding this earlier on where we find out a bit more about them. And I'm wondering whether it's because they don't want us to sympathize until the exact point where they stop being a possible suspect. But I don't think it's that calculated. I think it's just, we better tell people who they are before we kill them off.
That is a movie trope. That's a movie trope, though, because I've been going through the IMDb 250, following along with Darren Mooney's podcast. I've been watching the top 250 in reverse order, and only movies that I have not seen before. So I just watched Oliver Stone's Platoon, 1980. Speaking of 1986, it was the Best Picture winner for that year, same year that Vervoids came out. I was watching Platoon for the very first time last weekend, and there's a moment early on in the film where one of the other soldiers in the platoon comes to Charlie Sheen and opens up his wallet and shows a photo of his girlfriend. And that is the ultimate movie trope. I'm like, that character is going to die in the very next battle sequence, because that is what happens in Hollywood movies. As soon as a cop tells you that he has 6 months to retirement, or as soon as somebody shows you a photo of his beautiful wife, they're going to die in the next scene. And that is exactly what happens.
Or if a security officer tells you that it's his last shift and he's going to retire.
Exactly.
Yeah. Just one other thing on the suspects. I've got to attribute this to Gary Russell. Janet is really dodgy. And possibly because she only gets the name Janet, she hasn't got a patronym or anything like that, so she might be really sick of being patronized by Edwards going, you make lovely coffee, Janet, and all this sort of stuff. But she gets away with murder at the end of this. And no one ever draws the conclusion that it's her, because at the very least, she's responsible for the death of the Mogarians. There's nobody else who could do it. There's nobody else who could get in there and offer them refreshments and then throw it in their face and kill them. No one else would be around. So
this also raises a point from my audio essay, which you're going to hear in about 15 minutes time. This towards the end of the essay, because when you get to that last chapter of the book, it is an open question. It is implied in the book. Actually, the doctor specifically says that he was the only one who could have done that to the Mogarians when he's talking about Dolan, the eventual killer. And as someone points out in the documentary, they're all killers, but everyone is complicit. And Pip and Jane Baker very self-servingly say in the documentary that people in the production team were taking bets as to who the killer was, because they say everyone in the production office was involved in the mystery, and they even incorporate that into the novelization, as I'll say in the essay. The Inquisitor starts mentally keeping track of who the suspects are because she is in love with the mystery. That's Pip and Jane patting themselves on their respective backs. In the book, it is specifically revealed that Dolan is the one who killed the Mogarians. I actually went back and flipped. I didn't see that there was any time for him to have done that because he's with Mel in each of the 3 scenes preceding. So how did he have time to sneak onto the bridge, kill them, come back, join Mel, and then discover the corpses? So you're saying that you also mentioned this in the documentary 16 years ago. Janet would have been a better choice for the killer.
Because she did it. I mean, obviously this is an Agatha Christie pastiche. You can't really analyze this without mentioning Agatha Christie. And specifically, it's Murder on the Orient Express. And even just discussing that kind of blurts the ending out.
Which Honor Blackman is seen reading in the show.
Yeah, just to really hammer it home. Every one of them is complicit. Even if Tonka Travers, at the very least, he's a bully. He causes a lot of the problems with the staff that end up with Rudge betraying him. But everyone else is responsible for at least one crime in the whole playing out of this story. I've got one more question for you, though. I've got one more question. Because I'm not going to be around and because these are released in the wrong order. In terms of the Doctor's history, have you got any idea about when this is set? Because he's taken out of time. And do you know what I'm alluding to here?
You're asking me when it is set in relation to the other Colin Baker televised stories?
In relation to the Doctor.
Huh. That is an interesting question. So you're asking when... So we're watching... The Doctor learns about Terror of the Vervoids for the first time because he's watching it in the Matrix before he's actually lived the events of the story. So all we know is that it takes place at some unspecified point in his future, and as his last appearance as the Doctor is 2 weeks after Vervoid airs for the last time, we never get to find out because there is no Colin Baker season 24. So I don't know. When does this actually take place in the Doctor's own timeline?
Well, I'm going a little bit further out of field here. Up to this point, all Gallifrey stories are contemporaneous with the current Doctor, as if there's some sort of Gallifrey mean time.
Right.
Well, the presence of the Valeyard as a part of Gallifreyan establishment would suggest that this is the time of the 13th Doctor, isn't it? The 6th Doctor's taken out of time and brought to a future Gallifrey which is utterly corrupt. And they're now going back through time to fix their mistakes and try to purge the timelines. The Valeyard is complicit in all of this, and he's part of the infrastructure of Gallifreyan society. So I'm suggesting that this is all set in some 13th Doctor time period. Now, because before we get to a 13th Doctor, there's a massive time war and everything's disrupted, that whole event is completely wiped out. So just to add a little bit more confusion to it, but I'm suggesting that all of Trial of a Time Lord is set in the 13th Doctor's time. The 6th Doctor is taken out of time to their time, which is how he's able to see events that he hasn't seen, but they will have because they're a part of the established history. It does help make a bit more sense of the whole, even though a lot of Trial doesn't really make a lot of sense, and especially with we meet Mel before she's met the Doctor, so they do fix that in a later book. But if you take it from the point of view of this is a very timey-wimey story, it's just that they don't actually explain that at any point. This is the Doctor in his own future, fighting for his own survival, because they're seeing him as a weak point because he's the one who stumbled across the secrets of the Matrix.
In the very misunderstood 1997 novel The Eight Doctors, Terrence Dicks tries to undo the TV movie and do a new origin story for the Eighth Doctor, and he has the Eighth Doctor go back in time and visit each of his past selves at a very specific moment in their timeline. So he ends up writing episode 6 of The Demons. He includes a scene in the middle of part 3 of Unearthly Child. He has the Fourth Doctor in basically what is episode 5 of State of Decay. The bulk of the Eight Doctors is actually about the Eighth Doctor traveling in time to help the Sixth Doctor undo all the corruption in Trial of a Time Lord. So Terrence Dicks has this book set in the Sixth Doctor's timeline and not the Valiard's 13th Doctor timeline. I think your theory actually makes a lot more sense, and I'm sure Terrence would be kicking himself if he had the chance to hear this, because he might have done it differently in the Eighth Doctors if he had heard your theory.
And just also bear in mind, because obviously we haven't got to the book, but by this point in the TV show, we've already had Mind Warp. At the end of Mind Warp, the Inquisitor says, we had to act. She is as complicit as all of the other corrupt Time Lords. The Doctor's right, this is an absolute sham trial. It is completely set up to leave him with the blame for everything that's gone wrong with a future Gallifrey. And they see it as if we wipe him out, we can fix it all.
And if the trial...
But like Janet, she escapes to the end. She gets out. She gets away with it.
If the trial season had been better structured, if they had actually determined what the end of the season would be like before they started shooting with the cameras, if they had plotted out episode 14 before they filmed episode 1, that all could have been brought to light. But unfortunately, the story of the trial season is a production team falling apart, even worse than the John Wiles Donald Tosh team fell apart 20 years earlier in season 3. So the making of the entire trial season is a disaster, and unfortunately that will have to be brought up in a later episode when I get to the novelization of The Ultimate Foe, which you are not on. Jim, thank you so much for this week. This has been a longer interview than normal, but every second of it I think has been valuable.
Thank you very much. I think I'm back with you rather soon, aren't I? About a month away.
You are actually less than that, but it is not for one of the other Trial of a Time Lord stories.
It is not. It is not.
And we will see you very shortly. And thank you again for the musical composition. As someone who literally grew up on Sesame Street, hearing that song again brought back all sorts of wonderful memories.
It's just the inspiration of Ken Dodd once again. How can I make this silly?
Hi, this is Jason from the future. Earlier in the program, we discussed the actor Robert Wagner. I would be remiss in not pointing out that the actress, Natalie Wood, Wagner's ex-wife, passed away under suspicious circumstances in November 1981. Robert Wagner was in the vicinity when Natalie Wood drowned. In the year 2018, the Los Angeles Police Department did name him a person of interest in the investigation into Natalie Wood's death. That is still a cold case. It is open and unsolved as per the year 2022, as per Wikipedia. Robert Wagner has never been charged with the crime in the death of Natalie Wood. And now, back to our show. Doctor Who, The Trial of a Time Lord, Terror of the Vervoids, written by Pip and Jane Baker, televised as The Trial of a Time Lord, parts 9 through 12, teleplay by Pip and Jane Baker, televised in November 1986, paperback release date February 18th, 1988, target book number 125, cover artist, he'd want us to mention his name. The Time Lords have brought the Doctor to trial, accusing him of gross interference in the affairs of other planets. If he is found guilty, he must forfeit all his remaining regenerations. In his defense, the Doctor tells of an adventure set on board the Hyperion 3 space liner in his future. Answering a distress call, the Doctor and Mel arrive on the liner just as a series of grisly murders begins. Who is behind the murders? Do the enigmatic Mogarians have anything to do with them? Who sent the distress call to the TARDIS? And what hideous menace lies waiting in the hydroponic center? This is the beginning of a rough stretch, if you're reading the novelizations in story order, 3 straight books written by Pip and Jane Baker. Fortunately, on this show, we go in publication order. So this is the first Pip and Jane Baker book since way back in episode 106. And the next 2 books of theirs after this are at least spaced out by a fair bit. But the arrival of this one is a bumpy ride. The 4 Trial of a Time Lord season novelizations are going to be released out of televised order. So if you thought the production of season 23 on TV was a confusing mess, just imagine fans in real time reading the books as they came out, with parts 9 through 12 novelized first, followed by parts 1 through 4, with parts 13 and 14 coming out soon after, and then parts 5 through 8 coming out dead last, because Philip Martin's approach to deadlines, as we'll see when we finally reach the Vengeance on Varro's book in October 2024, a book that arrived 2 full years late, made Douglas Adams' approach to deadlines look good. Let's quickly reorient ourselves with how Pip and Jane Baker write. As with Mark of the Rani, the Bakers prefer short chapters, full of alternating long sentences, crammed with big and often misplaced vocabulary words and sentence fragments. Their verbiage often makes little sense. They describe one of the Valeyard's cheap shots at the Doctor as true. Of Security Officer Rudge, the Bakers confusingly write, Rudge was an avuncular individual who punctured his own authority by indecisiveness at crucial moments, a man promoted once too often. None of this is remotely true of the character as portrayed on television. The Bakers tell us the opposite of what they show, and not in a clever, unreliable narrator way either. As before, every word needs a modifier in the fiction of Pip and Jane Baker. Quote, in contrast with the guard's staccato orders, the muted heartbeat of the idling engines throbbed rhythmically through the tenebrous cargo bay. To be fair, this is not too different than the Ian Marter style that we encountered just last week in episode 123, The Rescue, but I think Marter carries it off with more atmospheric and appropriate word choices. Reading that sentence just now was a pretty gut-wrenching affair for this former English major and occasionally published writer. Some of the Baker's verbiage is clever. The phrase, the Busby of a hussar, is a wonderful simile, once you're done looking all that up on Wikipedia first, of course. Directly likening Rudge to Uriah Heep is a clever literary reference, and due to my age when the book first came out, I actually learned about Uriah Heep for the first time here, and not from David Copperfield, which I did not read until 2.5 years later in the summer of 1990. Other words don't work. Doland doesn't wear a sweater, like you or me, but rather a fawn tabard. The word capacious is fine, only because it's contractually required to appear in every Target book, though one suspects that the Bakers put it here only because it's 4 syllables long, and not because they knew of its very specific Whovian history. The word apposite, on the other hand, does nothing but give one flashbacks to the most improbable line of dialogue in the Mark of the Rani. Better is the spare description of Mel as a bouncy, red-haired young woman, about all that needs to be said. They also make much more of poor Edward's crush on Mel, taking a moment to show him ogling her. They did the same thing with the Master sizing up the Rani in their previous novelization too, come to think of it. Quote, Mel was a skilled computer programmer back on Earth. Her talents were practical, her outlook on life sane and level-headed, without any of the flights of fancy to which the Doctor's eccentricities might be heir. The Bakers are at their best when their text is freighted with observational humor or character insight, but such moments are rare. Better is the idea that Mel suffers from PTSD after the death of young Edwards at that first cliffhanger, a rare, insightful character touch for a much overlooked companion, and Jim and I did not get to it, but I think the Part 9 cliffhanger, with the massive explosion in the cargo bay set, and Bonnie Langford's screams matching the pitch of the cliffhanger sting, is one of the underrated Great Doctor Who cliffhangers. Remember, in my episode on the Mark of the Ronnie novelization, how the Bakers love to pound the reader with rhetorical questions, as if the plot is an academic exercise to be unraveled? Would it surprise you to learn that they do it again here? Were you aware that the Chapter 3 ending is basically a quiz aimed at the reader? Who put the bop in the bop shabop shabop? Who put the ram in the ram-a-lama ding-dong? Oh, ... And the ellipses ... Ending several sentences in a row ... Like at the end of Chapter 7 ... Once again, as Jim and I discussed earlier, or I should say, as we will have discussed, I am recording this audio essay before my conversation with him, I think Vervoids works on TV. It's my favorite story from Season 23, viewing them as 4 separate stories and not a single 14-parter, and I think most of the guest cast does an admirable job bringing Pip and Jane's polysyllabic dialogue to life. Not all of the cast is on the same page, and there are a couple of dreary performers in there having exactly zero fun. Looking at you, Commodore. But you can say that about almost any other guest cast of the era. However, you don't have the benefit of skilled actors knowing how to animate this dialogue in print, so some of the scenes can read awkwardly. Like the Doctor's argument with Doland, or is it Bruckner, can't tell them apart, about the, quote, ethics of what happened to Ruth Baxter in Chapter 13. Quote, Doland was becoming more and more irritated with these non-scientists who did not understand the ethics of his profession. The Bakers do express their displeasure with the framework trial scenes forced into their murder mystery. This is most evident in the same Chapter 13. The Inquisitor's patience, quote, was not limitless. Let's backtrack and determine why this novelization exists. The trial season was famously a production mess, the script editor resigning halfway through, a production team that hadn't figured out an ending for the season, even after the cameras started rolling on Ravelox, and nobody on site quite understanding the unreliability of the Matrix in the middle 2 stories. We'll see more of that when we reach Mind Warp many months from now. As the Bakers are writing this book after the season has ended, and after they were recruited to rewrite Part 14, they could have the opportunity here to smooth over some of the confusion in the story. I think they will, but not until the Ultimate Faux book, which is also coming out quite some time after this one, although not quite as far in the future as Mind Warp. I personally love the idea of a future companion, Mel, being introduced in media res. Page 16 references the Doctor's, quote, new companion and instructress, exclamation point. She is described in this chapter as only having brown eyes. Her backstory, such as she has one, is seated in dialogue, but the Bakers only give us oblique knowledge or insight along the way. We know Mel is stubborn because on page 91, she could not reasonably object to Lasky's obduracy because she was, quote, amply endowed with the same quality herself. The book might have been better served by giving us a more formal introduction to Mel up front, but the Bakers aren't deviating from the TV script, so we only learn about Mel organically as the story unfolds.
Far cry from the carefree life of Pease Pottage, eh, Mel?
I'm not complaining. You're really worried, aren't you?
I can't rid myself of the feeling I'm being used. Whoever sent that message knew me.
There's a made-to-measure candidate.
There is?
The Commodore. He's met you before.
He'd have said.
Would he? Admit he needs outside assistance.
An intriguing possibility, but that's all.
Look, the quickest way out of this is to solve the mystery.
That could also be the quickest way into trouble.
Why don't you ask for a passenger list?
Don't hustle me, Mel.
Who's hustling? All I'm saying is that you might recognize a name. Simple, isn't it?
Meanwhile,
I wander around, poke my nose into a few nooks and crannies, and see if anyone tries to make contact. Remember, we were restricted to the passenger quarters. This is only the lounge.
And by the way, the chemistry between Colin Baker and Bonnie Langford is criminally underrated. The Bakers in print do a better job of describing the Vervoids than the TV production realizes, or the frankly pornographic cover painting suggests. That is Tony Mazzaro, by the way. We learn in chapter 14 that the Vervoids have no noses because plants breathe through their leaves, their waxy leaves. Page 87 gives the game away about Security Officer Rudge's conspiracy with the Mogarians as he furtively checks that nobody ever overheard a, quote, telling exchange. The Bakers in that chapter also give us philosophical asides about the nature of fear and the Commodore's, quote, Solomon-like ponderings about how to handle the crisis. They compliment Colin Baker on his delivery of the Walter Delamere poem, which does sound like fourth wall breaking rather than an in-story comment. The dialogue in the book is, by the way, nearly word for word identical to what we heard on television, apart from ad-libs, like Colin Baker acknowledging on-screen his own hiatus-era weight gain in Part 11. That is not in the book because Baker would have come up with it after the scripts on which Pip and Jane base this novelization.
Well, I mean, wish I could get rid of my waste as easily, eh?
In a change from many Target books, the Bakers give a lot more space to the final episode compared to the rest of the book. Part 12 takes up 36 pages over 6 chapters and an epilogue, compared to just 31 pages over 6 chapters for Part 11. Some of the prose is Terrence-level good, like the description of the black hole of Tartarus at the end of Chapter 18, quote, the blood-red, inwardly spiraling tentacles of the black hole progressed through deepening purple to a sulphurous ebony. Chapter 19 gives us a more sympathetic look at Bruckner's attempt to murder every soul aboard the Hyperion. Quote, he had no wish to harm the crew, the passengers, or those with whom he had worked for years, but he knew with every vestige of his considerable intelligence that if the Vervoids were allowed to reach Earth, then that would be the end of humankind. This is an important passage because it also prefigures the Doctor's solution to the story, which leads into that silly genocide charge in The Ultimate Foe. Page 111, for the Doctor to eschew debate was a measure of their peril. That's funny. When the Doctor stops raising frivolous side arguments, that's when you know things are getting bad. The Bakers also make fun of their own script, the way that Terrence makes fun of other writers' scripts, using the book to mock bad dialogue or obvious padding. Chapter 20, quote, stating the obvious was the Commodore's sense of impotence. The Bakers do point to the Valeyard's outright villainy in the same chapter, as he strategizes. The Inquisitor must get the impression it was the Doctor who was abusing her indulgence. Undermining the defense must be the game plan. But they also take a victory lap past their own cleverness, telling us that the Inquisitor is really wrapped up in the murder mystery, and is silently arranging her own list of possible culprits. Speaking of murder mystery, the reader should enter Chapter 22 with unanswered questions. Who gassed Mel? Who tried to dispose of her in the ship's pulverizer in Part 11? Who poisoned Grenville? Hallett. And who threw the deadly acid at the Mogarians in Part 12? The Doctor knows and confronts the suspect here, but the Bakers delay the reveal by giving us a full page of dialogue without attribution, before telling us that it's Doland the Doctor is talking to. Apart from some rearranged scenes, one of the few moments in the book that doesn't appear on TV is that in the book, Doland is accompanied by several guards who are all killed by Vervoids, whereas on TV it's just one. Something else the Bakers do, which is either clever or inept, is telling, not showing, their characters' inner lives at the moments of their deaths. On TV, Kimber did nothing. In the book, right before he dies, we learn all about his many loving children and grandchildren, and we get a reminder of them again after he's dead. Of Professor Lasky, we learn that her, quote, extrovert hauteur was an armor, protecting the exposed nerve ends of a sensitive nature. What does that even mean? Also, a sudden burst of info on her parents, again as with Kimber in her very final scene immediately before she's killed. One of the problems with this look at Lasky is that she's played by Honor Blackman doing a turn on TV. and Blackman's performance doesn't make room for this type of subtlety or internal character conflict. We learned about Lasky's domineering father, sensitive mother who talked to plants, and her own research into plant sentience that led decades later to the creation of the Vervoids, who of course respond to this act of creation by killing her. In Chapter 24, the Doctor seemingly both sides the Vervoid slaughter of humans. Quote, he, with the superior intellect and empathy of a Time Lord, was able to encompass more than the narrow angle of a human viewpoint. On page 141, Mel, whose computer programming skills from her character brief weren't shown on screen until the year 2023, laments when, quote, keeping abreast of the rapid changes in computer hardware was the greatest challenge. The book ends abruptly with a 3/4 page epilogue with a tacked-on genocide cliffhanger that leads into the next TV serial, the two-part Ultimate Foe, about which volumes could be and have been written about what a disaster that was, but that is 7 books away in target publication order, the better part of a full calendar year between the 2 books in the target life cycle. And if truth be told, once again, the epilogue is less rude and dark than the epilogue to The Rescue, leaving us with a little more to discuss this morning, so I will end this audio equally abruptly and segue neatly into next time on Doctor Who Literature. Want to welcome back to the show my favorite sparring partner, Mr. Fraser Gregory. We are going back in time once again, as the Target books so often do in 1987 and 1988, back to the William Hartnell era, once again, back to the end of televised Season 2, back to Doctor Who's first pseudo-historical, back to the introduction of one of my favorite 1960s villains. We are going back to 1066. We are going to pick up that wristwatch on the beach. We are both going to don space helmets for cows, and Fraser and I are going to discuss Nigel Robinson's novelization of The Time Meddler. Thank you for joining me on another episode of Doctor Who Literature. The executive producer is David Barsky. This week's episode was produced, written, and edited by me. The episode was co-produced by Jim Sangster, who also served as my special guest, and wrote and performed the opening number, and designed our logo. This podcast can be found on most of your podcast apps of choice. You can find all past episodes at podcasters.spotify.com/pod/show/DoctorWhoLit. It really helps if you rate 5 stars and subscribe and spread the word. If you like the show, please tell anyone you can, any way you can. We only have about 30 books left in the Target run. It's a great time for you to help folks find the show and join us for the home stretch. You can find me personally on Blue Sky and YouTube at Doctor Who Novels, that's Dr. Who Novels, and on email at Doctor Who Literature, that's drwholiterature@gmail.com. Please drop me a line with your comments, questions, suggestions. Thank you for listening, and whatever you do, keep turning the pages.
Direction point! Direction point!
A Doctor Who podcast network.